Hello, it's time to do a wrap up of the books that I read in October. We're going to start with some stats and then I'm going to move into ranking and reviewing all of the books that I read, starting with the ones that I didn't really like, all the way up to my favorite. Let's dive right in. My stats come from the story graph. So in the month of October, I finished 11 books for a total of 3,006 pages, which is an average of about 273 pages per book. I also DNF'd 3 books in October, which is a lot for me. And we will talk a little bit about some of those later. These stats though are for the books that I actually finished, and the moods that I mostly read were emotional, adventurous, lighthearted, and hopeful. 50% of the books that I read were medium-paced books, 40% were fast, only 10% were slow. The length of the books that I read, the vast majority, 73%, were under 300 pages, 18% were between 300 and 500, and just 9% were over 500 pages long. Everything I read was fiction. No non-fiction this month. For the genres, I definitely read the most of fantasy. Then the other categories that the story graph offers were LGBTQIA+, middle grade graphic novels, and a few of the others. Everything I read this month I read physically. Some of them I was also listening to while reading physically, but everything I had a physical book for. Now for my star ratings. My average star rating was 3.55, which I feel like is a pretty average reading month. And the star ratings themselves are pretty spread across the board, but highly concentrated in the 4 stars. I had one 1-star book, and those of you who've been watching my channel probably know which that is. 1 stars are pretty rare for me, so we'll talk about it. I had 3 3-stars, 6 4-stars, and 1 5-star book. Anyway, those are the stats. Now let's have a little chat about some of the books that I DNF'd. The first book I DNF'd this month was Iron Widow, which I actually DNF'd quite early in the month. This is my second attempt at this book. This is a YA fantasy sci-fi adventure kind of story. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's gotten quite a lot of hype. The author, they are pretty big on TikTok and YouTube, I think. I can't quite remember how far I got into it, but I don't feel like I got super far. I'd say maybe like 70, 80 pages in. To me, I wasn't like hating this book. It just felt so fast paced and not in like a fun way, for me at least. Everything just felt like it was happening so quickly. Like it was just like a sequence of events that just felt like they were tumbling out of control. This book is so plot centric and it's so fast moving that me as a character driven and atmosphere kind of reader, I just didn't feel like I had any time to breathe and take in the things that I like about stories. And I'm glad that it's gotten a huge amount of success. I am, however, quite disappointed that I just couldn't get into the story. And I just felt myself getting frustrated while reading it and not wanting to pick it up. And I didn't want to like end up hate reading this book or resenting it. Clearly the pacing and the style just weren't for me, so I decided to DNF it. The other book I DNF'd I've had on my shelf for quite a while, that was Still Life by Sarah Winman. This is a book that I think I would like to come back to in the future, maybe. I feel like this is the sort of book that I would have adored like 2 years ago. But as soon as I started reading it, it just became so clear and obvious to me that it's not what I want to be reading right now. This is literary historical fiction. And those 2 words separately are just not things that I'm drawn to very often at the moment. Put together, just not my bag right now. The writing was very pretty and the characters seemed interesting, but I was struggling. I was struggling right from the beginning just to care and to feel like this was the sort of book that I would want to invest my time in. So I ended up DNFing at 24 pages. I'm not entirely sure if this is something I'm ready to part ways with though. Like I said, I feel like this is something I would have adored. I totally would have eaten this up a couple of years ago. So who knows, that I might come full circle, I might come back to things like this. But for now, I just knew that there was no point in spending time with this when this is not the kind of story that I want right now. So those are the DNFs that I wanted to share with you today. Now let's dive into ranking and reviewing the 11 books that I did actually finish this month. Starting of course with the 1-star. I don't have this book anymore because the minute I finished it, I was ready to get rid of it. And that is, of course, The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson. Now, I will leave a link in the cards above and the description box below for you of my full reading vlog and ultimately rant review of this book and this series. This is the 3rd book in Era 1 of the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, and it's the final in this kind of first era of the series. I've done reading reviews for all 3 of the books in this arc, and it started out reasonably strong for me. I enjoyed the first book. I had criticisms, but I was just along for the ride. I thought it was a really good, fun time. The second book is my least favorite book of the year. Personally, I feel it is one of the worst books I've ever read. I detested The Well of Ascension. So I made a little TikTok and I made my little video about The Well of Ascension. And for the last 3 or 4 months that that video has been live, I have been getting comments and comments and comments from the Sando fans telling me that I'm wrong, that I'm stupid, that I need to read The Hero of Ages because it makes The Well of Ascension worth the time. Basically, they were convinced, and I swear they almost convinced me too, that if I just read The Hero of Ages, I would understand retroactively The Well of Ascension and come to appreciate Brandon Sanderson on a whole new level, that the ending to this trilogy is just like mind-blowingly genius, and that I just had to read it. So after a couple of months of putting it off, that's exactly what I did. Curiosity got the better of me, and I put myself through another 800 pages of Brandon Sanderson. But to me, this book and this series in general was just hugely predictable. It was so simplistic. It's like so dialogue heavy, and Brandon Sanderson spends so much time explaining to you the plot just in case you missed anything. There is no subtlety here whatsoever. I predicted the big twist ending that everyone was super excited about. I predicted many of the other things along the way, which you'll see in that video if you want to watch it. Anyway, aside from predictability, I don't like Brandon Sanderson's writing. I don't like his storytelling style. I don't like how 500 to 600 pages of the book feel utterly pointless by the time you get to the last 200, and then all of this other stuff starts happening to negate the whole journey. Like the Sanderlanche, I don't enjoy it. On top of that, I don't like the themes that he explores or how he explores them. His exploration of class and of race, I think, was hugely clumsy, borderline offensive. It didn't jive with me whatsoever. The series is sexist, it's ableist, like there's just so many things that I didn't like about this series or this book. And despite the Sando fans being convinced that this book would make everything right, I have to say, at least for me, it did not. Now for my 3-star reads. An awful lot of the books that I actually finished in October are graphic novels, and I think in part that was because I was trying desperately to keep my head above water of an impending reading slump that I could feel coming on after The Hero of Ages. So a lot of the other books that I'm going to be talking about, not all, but a lot of them that I read especially after The Hero of Ages are graphic novels. And this first 3-star one is one of those graphic novels. This is Five Worlds, The Sand Warrior. This is the first in a graphic novel series. It's written and illustrated by a whole bunch of people, and this is kind of like a middle grade, targeted graphic novel. I love the art, I love the colors. That was the thing that drew me to this. And then obviously also being a children's bookseller, I'm always trying to keep on top of as much as I can, but especially graphic novels I personally love to recommend. This is an action adventure mystery story, I suppose, and it features a magic system that revolves around elements. Our main character, her magic deals with sand, and she is currently at like a sand dancer academy, but she's kind of like the not very good student. Anyway, things start happening with the higher ups in this world, and these kids kind of realize that something is not quite right, so they team up to try and figure out what's going on and to stop a terrible thing happening before it's too late. My favorite things about this were definitely the art. Like I said, I loved it. Also just the characters, I really enjoyed them and their interactions. The plot though, it was serviceable, it was fine, and this is a story that I think I can definitely find kids who I think will love it and that I can recommend it to. But just for me personally as a reader, it didn't blow me away. It sort of like met expectations, it didn't exceed them. It's quite a complex world. It's kind of like this sci-fi, interstellar, different planets kind of situation, which is pretty cool. And like I said, it is the first in a series, and I don't know how the rest of the story progresses. I can see like there's a lot of potential there. Like there's some really great world building in here, and as I said, great character development as well. I don't know that I'll be continuing with the series, but I'm not mad that I read it. I'm glad that I read it. It was cute. Beautiful art, just not captivating to me at least. My next 2 3-stars are actually each installment in a graphic novel's duology. This series is The Curse of the Chosen. In this first volume, it's sort of a bind up of 2 books that were, I think, initially published independently or separately. The first is A Matter of Life and Death, and the second is A Game Without Rules. And then the third is definitely the longest. It takes up this whole second volume, and that is called The Will That Shapes the World. This is a graphic novel series that we stock at work as well. It's got really quite unique art style, especially for, I don't know, like the genre and category of graphic novels for young people. I'd say this is for like 11, 12 plus. It's kind of, I don't know, maybe like the level up from Amulet, I guess. That was what I was thinking when I was reading it anyway. In this first volume, we're basically introduced to the inciting incident, which is the fact that the Empress has died. And this big malevolent lady, she's not called a witch, but that's kind of, she gives witchy vibes. She's been put in charge of finding a replacement for like the chief of this world. So she's gotten together 50 people from across the land, and she's put them into this trial that takes part over 3 different sort of segments, which are the 3 different books in the series. The first task is pretty simple. These 50 people are sort of like cast out to different ends of the land and they have to make their way back to the capital before like a time limit. The second task though escalates things very, very quickly. This ends up being quite a creepy, dark, eerie kind of series. Basically, this trial is compulsory. These people have to compete in this trial now that they're here. And if they don't, if they try to leave, they will die. So it's kind of got like Hunger Games vibes, but it's set in this, most of it is set in this like castle that becomes a character in and of itself. It becomes very eerie, weird, creepy. And although we do sort of have our main characters, the rest of the ensemble does work together really well. And I like that we spend time with like the different cast members and they all sort of have their own personalities and their own interpretations of what's going on. And it's an interesting dynamic, I suppose. When I first started this, I was blown away. Like that first book, which is probably like the first third of this first volume, totally blew me away. I was totally enthralled. However, the further I went along, the less swept up in it all I felt. I still enjoyed my time with it. I'm still really glad that I read it. It's quite unique to anything else that I've read. In terms of the tone, it strikes a really interesting tone of being really quite dark and creepy, but also kind of funny and just weird. So that's why it's sitting in the 3-star category, because I don't know, it just didn't blow me away like I was hoping it was going to. Like I was feeling so optimistic at the beginning. I think it's still a really solid read, and for people who enjoy graphic novels and who want something a bit darker, a bit more eerie, I think this is definitely a strong contender. A weird, absurd, creepy story that had very strong like occulty kind of elements. It was just kind of, it was a bonkers ride and I did enjoy it. Now for my 4-star reads, the first of which I wanted to show you was Akwaeke Emezi's You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. I've read a couple of Emezi's books before. The Death of Vivek Oji was one of my favorite books of the year that I read that book. It was just incredible. And I think I remember saying in the video in which I spoke about The Death of Vivek Oji that I would love for Akwaeke to write a romance story, because I just love the way that they describe physical touch and sensations. I think it's really unique and I just wanted to see that fully fleshed out in a romance novel, and I got my wish. It's about a woman who is finally kind of ready to start dipping her toe in the water of the dating scene again after her longtime love and husband has died. Although he died a couple of years before the book starts, his presence is definitely strongly felt. He's a bit of a ghost in this story. At the beginning, we see her diving right into some casual sex, which is quite explicit in the very first chapter, which gives you a good sense of what you're going to get in this book. And I don't know how much I want to say because I don't really want to give things away. I didn't know a whole lot about this book, but basically she sort of interacts with different men for different reasons. And it's interesting how all of these men are connected and her relationships to them. And I think if this sort of story had been written by almost any other author, I wouldn't have enjoyed it. I wouldn't have bought into it. And even though I didn't always like the choices or the way that our main character behaved, it felt messy, and the way that Akwaeke Emezi wrote it honestly ended up feeling very beautiful to me. And I mean messy in a good way, like messy in a very authentic, gritty kind of way. And although this primarily focuses on this woman's relationships with different men and how those evolve and change and how they get very tangled and messy themselves, one of my favorite elements of the book was watching our main character enter the world of dating again and sort of navigating these complex relationships with these men while also still dealing with her grief. Like, just because her husband died several years ago doesn't mean that that grief isn't still very present with her. And just watching her sort of navigate that was also something that I found very powerful about this book. I have to say that it did feel a little bit repetitive from time to time, sort of like in the middle to last third. And I also do feel like one of the characters, the way that they behave towards the end, it felt very convenient. Basically, I'll try to be vague, but one character behaves in a very toxic, unpleasant way. And I think that was partly, you know, maybe some people would behave that way, but I think it was also done to help us accept the current situation and be a little bit happier about the current situation, if that makes sense. And I just don't feel like that was entirely necessary. Like, this book is so raw and messy. I kind of would have liked to have seen it dealt with that ending situation in a bit more of a messy way. To me, having that character behave in the way that he did, it felt like it was a bit convenient, and it just made everything a bit cleaner and easier for both the main character but also for the reader to accept. I don't know if that makes sense. If you've read it, maybe you'll know what I mean. And so that felt like a little bit of a cop-out, but overall I just enjoyed the experience of reading this so much that I had to give it 4 stars. The next book is actually another graphic novel. It is Underground by Mirranda Burton. I don't have it here to show you because I borrowed it from work after it won our Readings YA prize for the year. This is a really powerful, fairly non-fiction, although I'm sure there are fictionalized elements, retelling of like the Vietnam War from the perspective of Australians for the most part. The art is done in black and white and I absolutely loved it. We start the story by getting to know a group of women who start trying to fight the conscription, the mandatory conscription. They call themselves Save Our Sons. They want to get rid of the mandatory conscription to stop men and boys in Australia being like forced to go over to Vietnam into the war. We watch as these women slowly become more outright active in just like the full-on anti-war movement and the sorts of things they get up to, how they protest, what they do, as well as like the Australian government and police response to their protests. There are a couple of other perspectives that we follow throughout as well though. We also see one of the men who do go to the Vietnam War and sort of like what his experience was like and what his life is like once he returns and sort of the impacts of being in war, PTSD, all of that sort of stuff. We also do get a perspective from a Vietnamese family in Vietnam as well. We do see them as like they're existing within a country that is currently at war. But then we also see them as they migrate to Australia and just sort of like what happens from there. It spans a pretty like decent length of time, just as the Vietnam War did, unfortunately. And it feels very honest and raw, and I was honestly captivated by these different stories and how they intersected. As you can see, there's a wombat on the front, and like that does tie in kind of like, there's literally a wombat that one of the characters is looking after, but then it also ties in this beautiful like metaphorical but like visual representation of these intersections that I honestly found hugely moving. I think it's a pretty powerful book. It's along the lines of something like Mouse or Persepolis. However, with the very important, I think, disclaimer that this is not written by someone with a lived experience of this war. And it definitely does focus mostly on the Australian experience and the impacts on Australians. Obviously, we do get the insight from that Vietnamese family and some Vietnamese characters, but the primary focus is on Australia, which was an aggressor. Like obviously the people of Australia, especially those that were forced to go into this war, were victims of the situation as well. But Australia itself, aggressors in this situation. Anyway, it's a complex thing, but ultimately I found this graphic novel hugely powerful. And I think like so often, I don't know about other countries, but I think in Australia, when we think of wars, we think of World War I and World War II. And it's almost as if war stopped then. And it like, obviously there are wars happening today, but Vietnam was like a hugely significant moment and it impacted many people and it continues to impact people today. So I think like a graphic novel like this, at least getting the conversation started, especially with young people to whom this graphic novel is targeted, I think could be a really powerful thing. And it does seem, at least from what I know, that the author has done an awful lot of research in making sure that the stories that she was telling were genuine to those people's experiences. And obviously it's literally dealing with the impacts of war across the spectrum, so plenty of trigger warnings for that one. Next up we've got She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is a historical fiction with fantastical elements, sort of like retelling and reimagining of like 15th century China. And it's basically set when China was under Mongol rule. And we meet a girl in the first chapters who is clearly living in very severe poverty. She lives with her older brother and her father. They are barely scraping by. But in the first few chapters we see as this girl's brother goes to see a fortune teller and basically gets told that he will do great things and that he has like this incredible fate ahead of him. She also asks for her fortune to be read and she is told that she will be nothing. And then tragedy happens and her brother and her father die. And so this girl is terrified absolutely of being nothing and of dying. And so we basically watch as she clings desperately to life and takes on her brother's face and his name, pretends to be her brother, and goes to live in a monastery and trains to be a monk. From there, we see as she becomes embroiled in war and politics and things just escalate and escalate throughout this novel. And ultimately, it's a story of the lengths that she is willing to go to survive. I read this so quickly. It was captivating. I loved our main character. I mean, like sometimes I didn't, but I loved being in her head and learning about her and her journey. I would say the first like third of this and the last third of this I loved. The middle third slowed a little bit. It did drag just a tiny little bit. Also, I have to say that although I loved the characters and I loved the writing and I loved just everything that this evoked, I did feel a little bit like a lot of the characters felt a little two-dimensional, not in every way, just in terms of their motivations. A lot of the characters that we meet have very, very clear, distinct motivations. Like our main character, she doesn't want to be nothing. She doesn't want to die. She wants to be great. And that is her, like her one motivator for the entire book. There is another character who is like completely and totally motivated by revenge and nothing else. And it's like these characters, they often say that like that's their fate and that's it. It doesn't matter what decisions they make now. Like that's the direction they're heading in. And I don't know, to me that just felt like a little simplistic sometimes. But to be fair, like I gave it 4 stars. So that is definitely me nitpicking. I just loved reading this. It felt like such a tense adventure. It's pretty brutal and graphic sometimes, and although it's kind of cool seeing like this badass woman like take over the world or, you know, like defy all the odds, all of that sort of stuff. At the end of the day, she is like very willing to like topple anyone. Like she's not pulling all the other women up with her. This is very much like a her destiny kind of thing, at least in this first book. And it's brutal, and so is our main character. But ultimately, I just loved the writing. I think the writing was so successful. It was beautiful. It really walked that line between being lyrical and descriptive, but also just holding so much tension and momentum. This is a period of history that I know very little about, so I don't know how much has been fictionalized. And I do think it's interesting that this is classed as fantasy. Like there are fantastical elements, but they are very subtle. It almost feels like they were retroactively inserted. Like this could just be an historical fiction novel, but there is a little bit of fantasy. And I mean, I really quite enjoyed those elements. So this is very much like heroic fantasy, but it just so many elements feel like they've been twisted on their head. And it's written so beautifully. It's so powerful. And like, yeah, I read it in like 2 days. I just could not put this down. Next up, we've got a middle grade novel. This is The Dangerous Business of Being Trilby Moffat by Kate Temple. This is a fairly new release, and I mean, I have been recommending this so hard at work. It's so fun. It's a bit of a weird premise. It's a very quirky book with a whole lot of personality. So I'm gonna try my best to give you the lay of the land. Basically, we meet Trilby Moffat, who lives just in like our regular world, except some weird things are starting to happen. Basically, things are happening outside of the time that they're supposed to be happening. For example, people are starting to speak languages that don't even exist anymore. One such person who falls victim to this strange illness is Trilby's mum. And it's happened for so long that eventually she just starts to go to sleep for really long periods. So Trilby and her mum decide to travel to like a distant relative's house just to like, I don't know, like have somewhere for Trilby to stay and be taken care of. And they find out that this woman is actually like the keeper of time. This woman is 300 years old and she lives in this little antique shop. And basically Trilby has to go off on this adventure to this island outside of time to figure out how to put things back in the right order in time. But of course things don't go as planned. There's some baddies, there's some weird stuff that happens, but there are also just such good friendships that are made along the way that I absolutely adored. And also, I mean, this is a little bit of a spoiler, so if you plan on reading this, like skip the next like 10 seconds. This whole thing is narrated by a taxidermied thylacine that Trilby meets at her 300-year-old aunt's antique shop. Like, it's just so quirky and weird, and I loved it. I loved the narration. It was really playful and whimsical. The adventure was really strong too. It was quite a bit of a mystery, and like I said, the friendships, solid. A-tier friendships. And I won't spoil too much, but there's also like a mystery, sort of like a play along at home mystery that you can do with the chapter titles as well. It's just so fun. I loved this. One of my favorite middle grades that I've read in a little while. Now I do have 2 more books that when I read them, I did mark them as 5 stars. However, they are part of a trilogy that I am now obsessed with. It's one of my favorites. And the final one I rated 5 stars. So we're just going to talk about them all together. This is my 5-star read of the month. And that is The Tea Dragon Society. The first 2 books I read, I adored, but I don't know, they just, as much as I love them, I feel like they're so small that they just didn't give me quite enough to justify a 5-star at the time. But the third one made me cry. It was so beautiful. So a 5-star it had to get. And I definitely feel like this series is greater than the sum of its parts. Like, to me, in my head, this is a 5-star series. I absolutely adored it. I'm gonna put this down, but I mean, I would love to hold it up this whole time so you can see how pretty it is, but I'm just gonna rest on it. It's pretty heavy. So this is a story set in a world where dragons exist. There are like regular big dragons, but there are also tiny little baby teacup dragons, and they are sort of like taken care by humans, and on their heads, on their little heads, they grow tea leaves that you can like take and drink. And when you drink the tea leaves of a tea dragon, you share their memories. It's just the cutest, most wholesome thing ever. These tea dragons live for centuries, but they are sort of assigned to a person, you know, for the length of that human's life. who sort of becomes their custodian, and they become very, very close to their human. In their first story, we follow a young person who is a blacksmith apprentice who's not really sure if that's what they want to do with their life. And then they, get caught up in the world of tea dragons. In the second book, we are still in the same world, but in a different town, and we're following some different people. In the third book, all of these people come together, and we follow all of the two sort of groups of people now in one place. And it's so cute watching them all interact and watching how their backstories sort of collide. On top of that, this series is just utterly wholesome and cozy. There is barely any tension. There's a little bit, but not a lot. It's just sweet. It's so charming. All the characters that we meet are just lovely, and there's just like some beautiful, casually diverse representation throughout as well. We got queer rep, we got disabled rep, we've got lots of different skin tones. Like it's beautiful to look at and to read. And what can I say? It made me so happy. Like nothing has made me more happy than the Tea Dragon Society lately. So of course, it has to be one of my new favorites. And although this hardback box set seems a little excessive, I adore it. It's so special. It's so beautiful. I love this story. And I love this world, and I love the concept. It just fills me up with good fuzzy vibes, Okay, so that is my reading wrap up for the month of October. I hope you enjoyed chatting about books and learning about the books that I read or DNF'd and what I thought of them. I would love to hear in the comments below what you've been reading lately. Let me know what you loved, or let me know if there's anything I should really avoid. A big thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon for all of their support, and especially big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie for their very generous support of me and my channel. Talk books with me in the comments. I'll see you in another video very soon. Until then, happy reading. Bye!